award-winning educator and licensed clinical psychologist, and the best-selling author or editor of 6 books, most recently Critical Thinking, Science, and Pseudoscience, Why You Can't Trust Your Brain. He has also authored more than 60 scientific publications relating to the assessment and treatment of psychological problems such as obsessive-compulsive disorder, Tourette syndrome, trichotillomania, and post-traumatic stress. Dr. Lack regularly presents nationwide and internationally at psychological and skeptical conferences. He has been interviewed by local, national, and international media outlets and consults for a variety of national and international companies. On the activism side of things, Dr. Lack concentrates on spreading critical thinking skills and scientific skepticism across a variety of settings, such as college campus outreach, public debates, community presentations, and more. He has written popular blogs for both the Skeptic Inc. network and the Center for Inquiry. He has presented at The Amazing Meeting and was featured in the well-received documentary Reasons to Believe, where he starred alongside Michael Shermer. Since 2012, Dr. Lack has been heavily involved in the Secular Therapy Project, a program for the nonprofit organization Recovering from Religion, including being the director from 2016 to 2020. As a native Oklahoman, Dr. Lack grew up in the rural community of Mountain View, where his parents still reside and farm and ranch on land that has been owned by the family for over 100 years. He currently resides in Edmond, Oklahoma, with his brilliant son and a passel of animals on a property called Free Thought Farm. And with that, I give you Dr. Caleb Lack.
Thank you, Fred and Dawn and everyone else for joining in today. I really appreciate it. I think Dawn said, I'm more than happy to chat and answer any questions after the presentation for as long as people want to. I'd rather be seeing you all in person, but I'm very grateful that I'm getting to talk to you all virtually today. And so what I'm going to be presenting on today, let me share my screen here. All right, everyone should be able to see that, I think, now. So I'm going to be presenting on why you can't trust your brain. And again, more than happy to take questions, towards the end of today and talk about whatever we want to. So now, as Fred had said, I'm a psychologist. I'm a clinical psychologist, and I've been studying psychology now for 23 years, which is a long time, I think. And during that time, one of the major things that I have really learned is, just how complex of an organ that the human brain is. Our best estimates right now are that we have somewhere around 86 billion neurons in our brain, with some 100 trillion different synapses or connections between those neurons. So we're talking about this, enormously complex, organ that is responsible for a very large percentage of what we do, think, feel, how we interpret the world around us. But even though it's so complex and it can do these, incredible things, it's also still really easily fooled. And one of the main culprits that often fools our brain is our own brain, it turns out. So, that's kind of why I titled this talk, why you can't trust your brain. Because, doubting has some negative connotations to a lot of people, and especially what we call or consider doubting yourself. But it turns out that doubting yourself and being able to kind of put a check on your own brain, on your own thoughts, is really the hallmark of an enlightened mind. People who never doubt themselves end up in situations where, they're easily manipulated by others, or They do things based on very poor reasoning or information or beliefs. And, really undergirding being a good critical thinker, being a good scientific skeptic is this idea of doubting one's own self. And not to a psychopathological degree, right, where you never believe in yourself, but to the degree that you think, hey, maybe I should pump the brakes a little bit. Maybe I should not just automatically, assume every thought that I have is true, and that everything around me is exactly how I want it to be all the time. But even though doubting yourself is so crucial to being really an enlightened critical thinker, it's actually really, really hard to do, and is not a kind of a natural skill that most of us have. Instead, it's something that needs to be developed and nurtured across time. So, one of the main reasons why it's often difficult to trust your own brain or the brains of those around us, it turns out, is because of what I refer to as the logically illogical brain, which is that, we often think and then act in ways that are irrational, but they are understandable. They're predictable in other ways, even though they're not necessarily logical. So in other words, our illogical aspects of how we, for example, process information are predictable. And we can say, hey, here's the situations where you're most likely to not think logically, to not think rationally. And knowing those kinds of things, when is it that I'm likely to be fooled by myself or other people? When is it that my brain is likely to misinterpret information? That's really crucial to becoming a solid critical thinker, a good consumer of information and rationality, and being able to sort sort of the wheat from the chaff. What's actually out there that's true versus what is it that maybe just other people want to be true. The two major factors that we talk about in terms of this kind of logically illogical brain are what we call cognitive biases and mental heuristics. Now, I have no doubt that most of you out there are familiar with these two kinds of terms, but let me just kind of break them down and show you some examples of these that provide, I think, a good understanding of why we are, again, so logically illogical. So when we're talking about cognitive biases, what we're talking about are these very predictable patterns of judgment that occur in specific situations, but in which we are biased. So in other words, the way that we're processing the information naturally and quickly is at odds with reality itself. So what these biases end up doing is they end up causing us to have very inaccurate interpretations of the world around us, or inaccurate perceptions of information and the quality and veracity of that information. So in other words, again, these are regularly occurring natural ways that our brain misinterprets evidence, whether that's, either our world around us or our own thoughts. There's a lot of different ways that this can happen. But again, it's very predictable, which means that once we start becoming aware of it, we can start doing something about it. Now, heuristics, on the other hand, mental heuristics, those are a little bit different. And what these mental heuristics are basically kind of mental shortcuts or general rules of thumb that really decrease the amount of effort that it takes for us to solve problems or make decisions. But at the same time, they generally lead us to kind of oversimplify reality. And this then makes us have really systematic errors in how we perceive reality, which can then become cognitive biases. So these mental heuristics often serve as kind of the building blocks of later cognitive biases that can really impair our ability to, again, see the world as it truly is, rather than how I want it to be or how someone else wants it to be. Now, before I go sort of further in showing the problems with these, I do want to emphasize that not all biases and heuristics are necessarily bad. And the reason that I want to emphasize that is because, just because we, and I mean we as humans, all of us, just because we have these biases and heuristics doesn't mean that we always make terrible decisions. Now, some of you may be saying, well, I don't know, but some of us seem to make terrible decisions all the time, which, yes, could be true. But there's a lot of different kind of heuristics that are actually very useful and adaptive to us. So one of these is what we call the less is more effect. So my guess is probably everyone in here has been overwhelmed at some point in trying to make a decision when there's too many options. So, a good example of this would be, back in the pre-pandemic times when you would, just go down to the grocery store and walk down the cereal aisle. And all of a sudden you see that there are hundreds of different kinds of cereal to choose from. Okay, well, which one do I choose? How do I choose the best cereal? And what most of us end up doing is simply falling back on and relying on, well, I've liked this one before, so we'll just keep going with that. Because it turns out when we have too many options, we tend to get overwhelmed and maybe not even make decisions effectively. And so this kind of less information can provide us with quicker, better judgments. Sometimes it is true. We also see what we call kind of ecological rationality, which is that, a lot of times we can't and we won't be able to have access to literally all of the information that would allow us to make the most well-informed choice. So instead, we have to act on what information we do have around us in our immediate environment and be able to kind of understand, how is it that my environment is showing or not showing me certain types of information, which lead me to have what I call good enough decision making. So in other words, maybe I didn't make the 100% best decision that could have been made, but I made a good enough decision in a much shorter amount of time, which ends up going well for me. So if I, for example, decide to travel somewhere that I've been a number of times before, I probably won't spend a whole lot of time researching the route and making sure that this is 100% the most effective, quickest, best way to go to this place I've been before. I'll just decide, well, I've been there before. I'll go the same way. It seemed to work good enough. Maybe there's another exit you could take that would get you somewhere quicker or a shortcut, but you're going to spend a whole lot of time and effort trying to find that when you could have maybe already been there. So heuristics can be certainly adaptive and useful, but they become problematic when they make you consistently have poorer decision-making than you could have. So some of the most common kinds of cognitive biases and mental heuristics that we see include things like the confirmation bias, belief perseverance, the representative heuristic, the availability heuristic, and there are literally dozens and dozens more of these. I'm just going to talk about a couple of these today and just concentrate on a couple. I can certainly give you all, resources to go explore the dozens of different kinds of biases and heuristics that we all have later if anyone would like those. So the ones I'm going to talk about, just so you know, are the confirmation bias and belief perseverance. And the reason that I chose these is because I think they're really the ones that underlie most of the problematic decision-making or poor judgment that a lot of people see happening around us in the world right now. So confirmation bias. What this is, and from kind of an operational definition, is the tendency of people to favor information that confirms their already held beliefs and ideas and discount that information that does not fit with what they already believe. So breaking this down, what happens is, when you and I get confronted with new information, so we're reading a newspaper article, we're seeing something online, we're hearing something on the radio, a friend is telling us something, we tend to do one of two things when we have that new information presented to us. If that information confirms and conforms to what we already believe, then what we do is we just kind of put our hand out, welcome it into our arms, right? Throw it a big party, say, come in here, we missed you. Yes, this is just the information that I wanted to see. This is amazing. And we tend to be very happy about hearing or seeing that information that, again, fits what we already believe. We also tend to forgive and forget any problems with it. So we ignore things that maybe aren't that accurate about it. Or maybe, something seems a little bit off about it, but I'm going to let it slide because it fits with what I already believe. Now, most interestingly, we're much more easily able to recall that information later compared to something that doesn't fit with what we believe. So when we have that information come at us, right, and it fits what we believe, then I say, this is great. It doesn't really have any problems to it. And I'm going to really remember this later on. Now, what happens if that information doesn't fit with what we believe? Well, we see the opposite occur. So if something, contradicts what we believe or, something that we greatly value, we tend to immediately discount it. Or if we don't immediately discount it, what we do is we look for all the potential and possible flaws that it might have, and we just tear it apart, saying, here's all the problems with this. And then what we do is we see it not be remembered very easily. So we may forget about it, or we may, later not even realize that we had seen this information before because we're so discounting of it and wanting to ignore it. Now, as you can imagine, this leads to a lot of problems, right? Those problems tend to be just amplifying our already held beliefs, right? So it is, again, one of these kind of hallmarks of an enlightened mind to doubt yourself. But that is a very unnatural thing to do, because when we see this kind of confirmation bias at play, what's happening is that we are really just not doubting ourselves at all. And we don't doubt other people as long as they're telling us the things that we want to believe, the things that we want to hear. We see this, to an incredible degree with a large number of our media outlets out there. So while there are some wonderful fact-based journalists out there turning out wonderful information and accurate information, they tend to have less viewers, less readership, less engagement than those outlets that do a lot of telling you what you want to hear. So if I am a highly conservative, right-wing person, then there's a good chance that I'm looking at information that's telling me what I want to hear, right? That's reinforcing things that I already believe. Same thing if I'm very liberal and left-leaning, is I'm probably going to pay more attention to those sites, those information that give me what it is that I want to hear. Now, the problem with this, obviously, is that unless you purposefully seek out that information and keep an open mind, that means you're missing out on a huge spectrum of information. And you may believe things for years or decades that are patently untrue. Dawn, I know, mentioned the horrible events that happened this week at the Capitol. And a lot of those can be very directly traced to this kind of confirmation bias, where what we see is people who are believing things that are patently untrue, but they're having lots and lots of other people amplify that message, tell it to them time and time again, and they're not taking that step back to doubt yourself, to put a check on yourself, to put the brakes on a little bit and say, hey, maybe there isn't a global ring of satanic pedophiles that are manipulating all of society, and this magical Q person is dropping information about it, right? Well, maybe if you'd pump the brakes a little bit, you would see how, again, utterly ridiculous that kind of thing is. But this confirmation bias is so very strongly in play for so many people all the time that it's the natural rather than an unnatural thing. Now, this confirmation bias, which all of us, myself included, engage in and have, is really a primary reason why scientific methodology needed to be developed. In scientific methodology, of course, what we do is we try to disprove our own hypotheses. When I run experiments, working out in my lab here at the university, what I try and do is I try and disprove myself, right? I try and find support against what it is that I think is true. Because what we naturally try and do is we naturally try to prove our beliefs. We naturally look for that information, and again, remember that information that fits with us and fits with our beliefs. But it turns out if you do that, just try to find information for your beliefs, it's very easy to do so. And it's very, very easy to get stuck in this confirmation bias loop where I'm just continually seeing new information, finding new evidence to support what it is I already believe, when perhaps I'm very easily disproven. And one of the, I think, dangerous parts about the confirmation bias is that the confirmation bias grows stronger the more emotionally charged a belief is, and the more deeply held a belief is. So if you want to easily manipulate people, what you do is you play on emotions and you play on deeply held beliefs. And that means that what's going to happen is they're going to get, again, into this loop where they're just seeing more and more and more information that confirms what it is that they already believe to be true, even if it's not. And this kind of leads into our second of these heuristics and biases that I really want to talk about, which is belief perseverance. And belief perseverance is really this tendency for all of us to stick with an initial belief, even after we see contradictory or disconfirming information about that. All of us on here, I'm sure, have probably at some point seen someone who was wrong about something on the internet. If you haven't, you probably haven't been looking very hard. And there's a good chance that some of you have even engaged in discussions showing someone is wrong, right? Telling them, here's why you're wrong. Here's the evidence that shows that you're wrong. And there's an even better chance that most of you have then seen those people not change their minds and be like, oh, well, I didn't know. I didn't know that information was out there. That's amazing. Thank you for showing me how wrong I was. That tends not to be what happens. And instead, what happens is people tend to entrench and dig in when shown contradictory or disconfirming information about what it is that they believe. This is why I tell my students all the time, arguing with people online is probably not a wonderful use of your time because it's really just going to entrench a lot of those beliefs. Now, I say that as someone who often does public debates and things like that. So what's the difference between that? Well, when I do a debate, I'm not attempting to change the other debater's mind. Like, that's not my purpose at all when I do a debate. What I'm doing is I'm attempting to sway the audience because they may not believe as strongly in something. And so, it becomes much more of a, knowing who's watching and playing to that, as opposed to just trying to change, the mind of the debater or the person posting false information or something like that. Now, in terms of specific types of belief perseverance, we see three main kinds that happen: what we call self-impressions, social impressions, and naive theories. Self-impressions are those ideas we hold about ourselves. So maybe I think that I really am a wonderful singer, even though, all the animals around start hollering or howling or running away whenever I start singing when I'm going out to feed in the morning. And I think, well, they just don't really appreciate it, right? I keep that belief that I'm a wonderful singer to myself because, of course I am. Or we have what we call social impressions, which are ideas about groups of people or the way that certain groups of people are. So I have the impression that, this group is like this, but this group, they're different. They're like this. And I keep that belief even when I might see many disconfirming incidences or members of that group who don't fit my belief. One thing that I talk about often is Schrodinger's immigrant, which is people who are coming in to the country who are simultaneously super lazy and yet stealing all of our jobs, right? So you've got people who have this belief that immigrants are all, oh, they're lazy, they're useless, they're just coming in and mooching off of us, but at the same time, they're taking all of our jobs. It's like, wait, hold on now. Or, well, yes, most immigrants are bad, but this immigrant family is an exception because they did X or Y. And so I'll still hold on to that social impression or maybe that, negative belief or biased view of a group, even if I see disconfirming evidence multiple times. And then we have what we call naive theories, which are just generally ideas that we think the world works, that aren't necessarily backed up by evidence. So one of my favorite ones of these is the fact that, most of us right now are sitting down and sitting still. And it seems like, the sun is rising and setting, right? When in reality, we all know that's not what's happening. What's happening is Earth is moving, right? We're moving. We're hurtling through space. And that causes this illusion to happen of the sun rising and setting when really it's stationary and we're moving. So, but there's all these different ways that beliefs stay believed. And even when they don't have good evidence for them, even when they're very wrong, we can see a lot of things like what we call illusory correlations. So illusory correlations are where we see or believe that there's a relationship between two things when there's not actually a relationship between those. So being in mental health and healthcare, one of my favorite examples of this is what's been referred to as the lunar effect. And my guess is a lot of you all are familiar with this, where it's, oh my gosh, there's a full moon. So therefore, we're going to see more people come into the ERs with mental health or going crazy, or we're going to see, higher rates of crime or things like that because the full moon is out. Now, this idea dates back several centuries to a physician named Paracelsus, who, coined the term lunatic, which actually comes from luna, moon, tic, a crazy person. A lunatic is someone who's being basically crazed by the moon. Now, when we use that term today, most of us don't think about that or think about that it means something to the moon, but that's really where it comes from. And it turns out we can do statistical examination of these questions. Now, I see, tons of people, whether they're nurses, physicians, mental health clinicians, who think that there is something to this. But when you really break it down, what it is that there's not. So if we, for example, look at rates of crime compared to the phase of the moon, we actually find that most crime goes down when the moon is full, primarily because it's lighter outside, and it's harder to skulk about and hide when it's lighter outside. We also don't see any solid relationship between things like inpatient hospital admissions for mental health reasons and phase of the moon. It's just that people tend to remember when it was a full moon and things got a little hectic and a little busy, and they're on the lookout for those relationships. So, yeah, I see a relationship, even though statistically there's not one there. And this can often feed into what we call our distortions of evidence, which is where we remember the hits and we forget the misses. So I would remember those times when it was a full moon and we had a lot of, suicidal patients, but I forget those times where it wasn't a full moon and we had a lot of suicidal patients, or it was a full moon and we didn't have a lot of suicidal patients. But my belief makes me, in part, do that confirmation bias. Again, remember those hits, those confirmations, and forget the misses. Forget the things that don't fit with what I want to believe. So when we put these mental heuristics and biases together, the big picture is that beliefs tend to stay believed, and people tend to seek out and remember that information that confirms those things they already believe. Now, this is, as you can understand, very problematic, because what it does is it leads us to be in these essentially what we call filter bubbles, where I'm not getting information from outside of my belief system, or I'm unwilling to engage in that information in a rational, logical way, which means that I hold on to beliefs that are often filled with inconsistencies and riddled with problems. Now, another wonderful way that our brain tricks us and why we often can't trust us is because we really oftentimes build something from nothing. And what I mean by that is that we frequently hear and see things that aren't actually there because it's what we expect to see and hear. Now, I'm not talking about, things like hallucinations, not what I'm talking about. That's a completely different thing. What I'm talking about here is something that happens thanks to priming and the confirmation bias. And I'll show you some examples and talk a little bit more about what we call pareidolia. So it looks like a number of you all are probably of an age where you remember a large amount of consternation over the rock and roll music. Now, what I specifically want to talk about is in the 1970s and 1980s, when a large number of parents were very concerned that their children were listening to rock and roll music that had satanic messages in it. And these messages were not just out there for everyone to hear. So in other words, they weren't just, saying, hey, we love Satan, or anything like that. No, instead, these messages were supposedly inserted via what's called backmasking. Now, I hope this works. I think it will.
Hello, my name is Simon Whitehouse, and I'm a London Blue Badge Guide.
Let me show you.
Right in the heart of London's glittering theatre.
London's glittering theater. I just heard that. I don't know what that's about, but so let me share this right now. All right, so many of you may be familiar with Led Zeppelin's Stairway to Heaven. So here's a small clip of that.
Caleb, we can't hear the sound. You may need to share it.
Oh no, you can't hear it. Do I have to share the sound?
Click the share audio button too.
Okay,
do your share.
Hold on there, just a sec.
Sorry to interrupt.
No, I'm sorry. Let's see. Can I share?
In the lower left corner, I believe there's a checkbox for sharing audio.
Oh, there we go. Share sound. Okay. Now let's see.
If there's a bus.
Can you hear that, Don?
Yes.
Okay.
If there's a bustle in your hedgerow, don't be alone there. It's just a sprinkling for the May Queen. Yes, there are two paths you can go by, but in the long run, there's still time to change the road you're on.
So, many of us have heard that song probably thousands to hundreds of thousands of times in our life, right? But did you know that there's a secret, backwards masked satanic message in it? Many of you may be surprised to hear this. Now, what backmasking is where you take something that sounds one way forward, then you reverse it and play it, and now you have some different kind of message. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to play that little clip in reverse for you right now. Now, if you're like me, most of you are totally in shock right now because you could very easily hear what that was supposed to be, right? Well, here, let's show you what is supposedly being said here in this backmasked song. And I'll play it again so you can read it and hear it again. So, as you can probably imagine, that song is, of course, the reason why most of you are devil worshipers at the moment, at home worshiping devils right now, I'm sure, right? There's tons of other examples out there. If you search up backmasking and rock and roll music, you can have quite a bit of fun with some of these. Is that a thing? Is that something that's happening? Or are we making something from nothing? I'll get to that answer here in a minute. Before I do, I want to show just a couple of other examples of this. So some of you may be familiar with the face on Mars. So in 1976, a couple years before I was born, the Viking 1 spaceship sent back photos of the surface of Mars. For the first time, very close-up, amazing photos. And they included one photo that showed what appeared to be a 2.5 kilometer long face. And you can see it here with the original photo and then blown up, so we got eyes, nose, mouth, etc. This became a very big explosion, and people talking about the face on Mars, finding other things in the pictures. A group of pyramids, for example, was one of them that some people reported, thinking, oh my gosh, what's happening? There's people on Mars, or maybe they're looking at us and building faces because we are so beautiful, something like that. What's at play here in both of these, both the backmasking and this kind of Martian face, is that our brains are amazingly well evolved to misperceive information in specific biased fashions. And what we call this is pareidolia. And pareidolia is this tendency for our brains to interpret either random or ambiguous stimuli as being something very particular. So all of you have experienced this at some point where you've looked up at a cloud and you thought, oh my gosh, that cloud looks like a dog, or that cloud looks like, you know, George Washington's face, or whatever it would happen to be. But this is a very natural thing that happens to all of us. So for example, this is what's called the Cookie Monster geode. So if you look at that picture there, if you're familiar with Cookie Monster from Sesame Street, you can see that, you know, this geode is Cookie Monster, right? He's very hungry right now. He's very excited. Or you can look at these boxes, which are very disapproving of you right now. And really, you know, steepling their hands and being very, very angry and upset at you and disappointed about your life's decisions. Now, in neither of these cases, of course, did, you know, nature, you know, cause a Cookie Monster geode to occur, or did the designers of these boxes mean for them to look so disapproving of you? Well, what we're seeing is we're seeing what we call pareidolia, where particularly for human faces, our brains are very naturally prone to seeing human faces. And there's a number of reasons for this, but the, you know, kind of the one that I just want to touch on briefly is because of the very high survivability of us being able to recognize other faces and what those faces mean. So when I encounter someone, for example, I can very quickly look at their face and I can have a good idea of what they're thinking, what they're feeling, what sort of potential actions they might have. So our brains are very primed at all times to recognize faces, it turns out. We're also very highly primed or ready to experience what we call religious imagery. And see religious symbols for those of us who are religious, which is, as you guys are all aware, a large percentage of the population. So this is where we see people who, you know, see the Virgin Mary in underpass stains, or, you know, Jesus in beer glasses, or, you know, on toast, or things like that. And the more likely our confirmation biases are present, the more likely we are to actually experience this pareidolia. And so, for example, if I am highly religious and I'm constantly thinking about religious iconography and symbols and signs, then I'm going to be ready to see those signs in everyday life, because I believe that, you know, God shows X or Y through these different kinds of signs to people. So, you know, oh my gosh, I was late, but I got a great parking spot, so I was on time. You know, God's looking out for me. And there was, you know, 2 pieces of bubble gum in the shape of a cross there when I stepped out. So that's really showing that, you know, he had picked that out for me and was looking out for me. But you know, this confirmation bias certainly gets us ready to see pareidolia, but it really happens because of what we call priming and patternicity. And priming is this really interesting phenomenon in psychology that's a form of memory, but it's a form of what we call implicit non-conscious memory. So it's not something that I'm purposefully trying to do. Instead, it's just that being exposed to stimuli in one context, especially if it's repeated, changes your behavior in another. And for our purposes, what I'm saying is that it makes you more likely to recognize, recall, or pay attention to similar stimuli in other contexts. So if I, for example, am constantly surrounded by crosses or pictures of the Virgin Mary, then I'm going to be very prone to and primed to seeing those things, those patterns, even when they're not actually there in other situations. So this is a priming example. So I hope everybody can see that. And if I just asked you, what is this, right? What is this? Most of you would pretty easily be able to say, well, that's a picture of a woman's face. right? Like that's not too hard. It's not a trick, right? I'm not trying to trick anybody, just a picture of a woman's face. And then if I show this and I say, okay, well, what's this? You know, given that I just showed you a picture of a woman's face, and then I put this up, many of you are going to be now primed to see a woman's face. So there's the eyes, there's the nose, the lips, you know, the hair. She's kind of shadowed, she's in profile. But if I had repeatedly showed you pictures of someone playing the saxophone, and then I showed you this picture, you'd be much more likely to think, oh, it's a picture of a person playing a saxophone, right? There's their nose, there's the saxophone, there's their hands, they've got their lips blowing on it, etc. Now it's the same picture here and a while ago here, but priming can change how we interpret stimuli. And when we combine that with what we call patternicity, which is our really kind of natural tendency to make and find meaning in meaningless stimuli, then we start seeing this pareidolia become very, very problematic for us in terms of one of the reasons we can't trust our brain. So patternicity, again, sort of just seeing meaning or making meaning where there's not there, typically goes hand in hand with what we call agenticity, which is seeing something as causing those patterns that I'm perceiving, even if those patterns are not real. So let's put all this kind of together in an example. Our cognitive biases and our ability to be primed, as well as our natural human tendency towards patternicity and agenticity, all combine to make us see things that aren't actually there. Like this picture, for example. Most of us can look at that and very easily discern that, oh, what is that? It's a heart, right? It's a heart. Hey, Valentine's Day is coming up before too long. Many of us probably have people we love and care about. Yeah, it's a heart. It's not, it's a cloud, right? It's not a heart. It kind of looks like that, but only if we're primed to see it. So let's go back to our satanic rock and roll music and kind of see how this all comes together. So let's say that in the late 1970s, early 1980s, you're a parent and you're really concerned about the dangers of rock music influencing your child, right? With all of the sex and the drugs and the Satan. And so what happens is, you know, you begin to listen to some of those records because you've heard, hey, they put these backwards messages in there. So, right, you know what, I'm going to take this over to the turntable. We're going to play it backwards, see what happens. So you start listening to those, and now what's happened is you've been primed to hear certain words: Satan, the devil, sex, different kinds of drugs, etc. And your brain, because you're prone to patternicity, then picks out those words from sounds that are actually very ambiguous and can mean a large number of different things. Now, because you found a pattern, you're also naturally going to assume that there's an agent behind that pattern. So in other words, someone put this here. Someone did this on purpose, and it must have been these evil, devilish rock and roll musicians. Now, because you already didn't like those kinds of musicians and that kind of music, that then fits your confirmation biases. And so you very quickly, easily accept that this is true, right? Like this must be what's going on. But from a good skeptical, rationalist sort of perspective, we have to stop. We have to doubt ourselves for a minute. We have to put the brakes on and say, okay, well, is this true, right? Is this true? So in other words, we have two questions that we have to answer. And the first is, okay, were people purposefully inserting such messages? And then two, even if they did, could those messages have any impact on someone's actual behavior? So in other words, could listening to something that was backwards, could I, one, interpret that, decode it, and then two, would that somehow influence my behavior? And the first question is pretty easily answered, no. All the musicians we're very clear that, hey, we're writing songs. If we want to put something about sex or drugs in there, we just put it in there forward. We don't have to put it in there backwards. We just write it in there. It's pretty clear, right? And so in terms of satanic and occult messages, musicians are not actually inserting that. And for the second question, so in other words, even if there was a backmasked, message, could I understand what it was? And research is pretty clear that, we're really good at understanding speech when it goes forward. We can't really do that when it's going backwards. And especially we can't hear something that's played forward, stop, flip it in our head, and then play it back and understand what it says. Even if we're listening to something like speech, for example, that's played backwards, about the best we can do is tell if it's a male or a female speaking. That's it. We can't, flip it and figure out what they're really saying in a forwards way. So it's just not part of our cognitive repertoire. And we know from other research that it's only if people are purposefully primed to hear these kinds of phrases that you detect them, which is why I played for you that Led Zeppelin bit. Most of you hearing it backwards probably weren't able to really understand or hear any words per se. But when I primed you by talking about Satan and the devil, and then I showed you what those lyrics said, all of a sudden now you could, it kind of sound like Satan there, or 666, but only because you were really primed to hear them. So in other words, people aren't inserting these messages and weren't. And even if they had been, there wasn't any way that those could influence your behavior. So, we see the same sort of thing with these religious icons, seen on doorways or in toast or, wherever it happens to be. The face on Mars is another wonderful example. And I can go into that if you guys want me to later. But this kind of pareidolia is really a great example of all these different kinds of biases at play. NASA released that picture of the Mars face purposefully because they thought it was hilarious. And they explained why it looked like a face when in reality it was just a mesa. But people just ignored that information, right? It was, due to the shadowing because of the angle of the sun. When they actually, took high-res pictures of it, this is what it looks like, right? It does not look like a face. It looks like a mesa. But if you go out there and search face on Mars today, you'll still find tons and tons of websites and people who are shouting, from the rooftops about the face on Mars and how that's evidence of this extraterrestrial civilization in our own solar system. So, kind of concluding and wrapping up, our brains are very, very good at fooling us. And although we can't rid ourselves of our cognitive biases, we can decrease their effects on us. And one of the first steps in doing so is what we just did today, which is just awareness raising. Now, the problem with just awareness raising is that it mostly allows us to see these biases in other people and not really start doubting ourselves. That's where you have to start getting more into kind of critical thinking and scientific methodology to be able to examine your own self. But it's a good first step because it can lead to this increase in self-doubt, which, as we talked about earlier, really is that kind of hallmark of a good critical thinker. So, just knowing these biases, knowing these heuristics and kind of what they look like is great, but you have to take the next step to really purposefully and critically examine your own beliefs, which is, something that I know many people here in the Humanist Society have done. And it's not necessarily an easy or fun process most of the time, but it leads us to getting closer to understanding reality as it is rather than just how we want it to be. And also helps us make better decisions, it turns out. So using things like scientific method to understand why, for example, the COVID-19 vaccines work or don't work, they work, it turns out, can help to decrease those impacts of cognitive biases and heuristics and things like that. So with that being said, I'm just going to turn it over to Dawn and Fred, I think, for the questions, and stop sharing, and just happily stay in however long you guys want me to, and answer questions.
Caleb, I want to thank you very much. I do appreciate everything you did. It was very good. In the chat, there was a lively discussion going on, and repeating some of the stuff you were saying. We'll go back through those now, if you don't mind. When you started talking off about doubt at the start of your presentation, Laura Davis said that doubting oneself also allows you to expand your thinking because you aren't 100% sure you're correct, to which Sherry also said it also humbles you, so you can't be open to being incorrect. So you can be open to being incorrect and see other viewpoints.
Yeah, I think humility, what I call skeptical humility, is one of the best outcomes of being a critical thinker. And that's that, that kind of that small voice that's all the time saying, like, hey, you might be wrong, like, or hey, you don't maybe know everything that you think you do. So let's check. Maybe let's see somebody else out there who knows more than me. One of my best friends is a biologist. So when I have biology questions, I go to him. I don't assume that I know everything about biology just because I know a little bit, right? So having that kind of humility, I think, is crucial to being a good critical thinker.
Mm-hmm. Robert Bosca had a question for you. Is it possible to see the world the way it really is?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Robert. I think that what we try and do in science and in skepticism is get as close as we can with the instruments that we have available. So whether that's the instrument of my brain and trying to reduce the effect of the biases that I have, or whether that's instruments like ever more powerful telescopes or microscopes or gene sequencing techniques or whatever it is, I don't know that we'll ever see the world exactly as it is. If we did, I think science would be done, and I kind of think that's not going to happen. There will always be more questions and more things for us to explore. But I think what I would say is let's just try and get closer to reality.
Mm-hmm.
But, what was it? The Rashomon was a movie,
Mm-hmm.
and the parable about the blind men and the elephants.
Yeah.
I mean, to me, that principle that everything is going to be perspective anyway. So we're never going to actually see anything, and the best that we can do is improve.
Yeah, I think for sure, Robert. I think Rashomon, wonderful movie. For those of you who haven't seen it, a Kurosawa film. And then, the story about the people, touching different parts of the elephant and describing it in so many different ways, right? And I think both of those, what they point to is the need for relying not just on your own self, right? But for the kind of the totality of information available. So, when I just have this narrow, small slice of information available to me, that's all I can base my judgment on. But if I instead have access to a wider variety, all of a sudden now I start getting a better, clearer picture. And I think that's really, that kind of undergirds a lot of, for example, scientific publishing and the move towards open access of information that allows us to have a wider view than we would just as any one individual.
Yeah.
So Laura Davis had a comment while you were talking about confirmation bias. And then I have a question about that, and another comment from Laura Davis too about confirmation bias. Is it really news that if it bothers her that stuff is labeled as news when they're really just giving you info that confirms your bias?
Yeah, it bothers me too, Laura. I think we're all aware that there are many news outlets out there that are hyper biased. One of the things that I try and rely on, personally, are those outlets that are less biased or more fact-based, because it is very frustrating when something's called news, when it's just entertainment.
True. So that kind of, you already started to answer Al, and I always mispronounce Al's last name. I'm sorry. So I'm not even, Al Canistraro, and I'm going to give up there, Al. If I'm wrong, shoot me. So Al asked, what do you do yourself to avoid the pitfalls of confirmation bias in your consumption of news and opinion? And what practices do you suggest?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Al. So one of the things that I try and do in terms of news is, again, focus on those things that are actually more fact-based reporting. So things like the AP, for example, NPR, and then things that are just slightly outside of the pure fact-based, which is more things like the Washington Post, the New York Times, maybe, and really focus more on that for getting my news, and less on those, let's say, hyper partisan pieces of media on both sides, whether that's the HuffPo or Fox News or wherever it happens to be. I try and stick to the news that's actually real. And then in terms of opinions, one of the things that I personally try and do, and it's oftentimes very uncomfortable, is I try and read opinions from very differing viewpoints. So, personally, I'm a secular humanist and I'm a scientific skeptic. I fall, much more on the socially liberal and fiscally liberal side of things. But I do my best. I don't always succeed, of course, no one does, but I do my best to try and read information across the social and economic and theistic sort of spectrum. And that includes having people in my social media feeds that are across those spectrums. Even if I don't agree with it, or if I think they're completely insane, I find that it's very useful to see what it is that those folks are thinking, because that helps make me a better thinker and better able to emphasize with those people. So, even though I'm, not agreeing with them, it's useful, I think, to understand kind of what their mindset is, to know how to approach and discuss things with those folks.
So Laura Davis had a comment about this during your presentation that kind of echoed a lot of what you just said here, that her suggestion was change the channel to listen to the other side, despite truly disliking it. Read instead of watch reporting where sound bites abbreviate ideas. Realize that if it makes me feel prickly, it might be a sign I'm feeling rubbed against a bias. And so I need to pay attention to that.
Yeah, when I find myself being feeling discomforted, by reading something, I think, why? Is it because there's maybe a little more truth to that than I thought? I hadn't really thought about that, or what's going on there? That's a great idea, Laura.
Okay, we're now for a totally kind of different question, from Andrew, who asked, how often should I question my belief that there is not an interventional supernatural entity?
Oh. Interesting question, Andrew. I think that it's not a question of how often we should question our beliefs. It's making sure that the beliefs that we have are held because of good reasons, if that makes sense. So I, for example, don't think there are any interventionalist supernatural deities out there. I don't feel the need to question that too much on an everyday basis now, because I've spent the last 30 years questioning and reading and learning, and feel like I have come to a pretty solid conclusion of that myself. I think the problem is where we have people who have never questioned themselves and their own beliefs. So, they never escape from that bubble. They never try and step out of it to see, hey, maybe there's other opinions or other facts out there. So I'm sure, like many of you, I've read the apologists for the various kinds of religions, or been engaged in that kind of information seeking, and come across, thinking, well, this is pretty wanting, right? There's not a lot here that's convincing me. So I think it's more of, making sure that you're solid in your beliefs rather than necessarily questioning it on a temporal basis.
The broader question is, how do you know that these beliefs that you hold have been well thought out over a period of years and you no longer have to question them?
Yeah, that's great. So, I think in science generally, when we have very well tested, well supported hypotheses that lead you to have good theories, it takes very, very high, strong, large amounts of evidence to shift those, right? So if for me thinking, hey, there's no interventionalist supernatural entities out there that I can, pray to that will then change the course of world events, I would have to have some pretty extraordinary pieces of new evidence come up. Evidence meaning, of course, like good, repeated, scientific, verifiable evidence to start shifting those beliefs. So I think it's about, the kind of the weight there, I would say, Andrew.
So Sherry had reiterated the comment about confirmation bias, how to avoid it, about regarding news. She suggests periodically listening to various differing news sources and other folks. And she thinks everyone should do this. It aids in understanding, but albeit not solving anything. When you talked about, we're talking about, and I doubt that I can say the word, pareidolia.
Yeah,
pareidolia. And one comment from Carol was, what about, how does this relate to Rorschach test?
Sure, yeah. So Rorschach tests are highly pseudoscientific. So even though I think they're probably the most widely recognized or known kind of psychological tests out there, they're really fairly useless, it turns out. So when we look at those ink blots and we start, kind of figuring out, okay, well, what's in there? Yeah, like we're going to see things that we're being primed to see, or that we're exposed to a lot in our environment. And we're going to try and naturally make meaning of those meaningless things. And it's kind of fun. It turns out the Rorschach test in part developed out of a parlor game that was very popular in the 1880s in Europe called Blotto. And that's literally what people would do. They would gather in their homes and they would take ink and drop it, fold it, undo it, and then come up to see, or compete to see who can make the most creative answers out of the blots. Mm-hmm. So it's super fun to do, but it doesn't give you much information about the inner workings of someone's mind.
Mm-hmm. So then when your pictures of the boxes elicited a lot of comments. Barbara thought that the boxes look like they are plotting. Laura Davis said they must be ballot boxes. Olga commented, it's question whether it's because human brains are evolved to look for patterns.
Yeah, I mean, they definitely are. We're 100% primed to look for patterns because it's very adaptive in many ways. Mm-hmm. It allows us to survive in situations or recognize situations that are going to be dangerous for us and avoid those, or, escape in some way. So yeah, there's actually a lot of research on that kind of the evolutionary benefits of these cognitive biases and heuristics and patternicity and agenticity. Mm-hmm. So lots of that out there.
Yeah. Sherry asked whether wild animals are also wired to see faces, whether it helps them from a survival viewpoint to connect to their own species, mother, tribe, etc.
So that's a very interesting question, Sherry. I think that, all animals are undoubtedly naturally prone to seeing patterns and recognizing patterns. I think humans are particularly prone to faces compared to other creatures, just because of the amount of expressiveness in our faces compared to most other animals. One particularly interesting example of that are dogs. So, you know, I'm a fan of dogs. I don't know how many of you are dog versus cat people out there. I'm a fan of dogs. I like cats fine, but they don't like me. They make my body inflame. So dogs have been sort of purposefully bred over the last 30, 40,000 years to look less wolfish. So they tend to have more expressive faces. Their eyes tend to be much bigger compared to wolves. And you tend to see more movement in the faces and the reaction to, you know, humans in general. So I think it definitely has that kind of a survival benefit in terms of the things that we've been intelligently designing ourselves, as it were.
So there was one comment here from Bruce Johnson that I thought was interesting. He said that the Beatles were well known for their secret messages. My own thought on that is that all these stoned musicians from the 60s and 70s and 80s must have been a lot smarter than everyone gave them credit for if they could embed backward messages in their songs without, you know, I don't know how they could do it and still have their lifestyle.
Yeah. The Beatles were some of the first to actually play around with back masking in the studio very purposefully. So that's fun that you brought that up, Bruce. But they were letting people know that was happening, and you could, you know, see that sort of thing pretty easily.
Okay. Carol had a question. How do the biases relate to our childhood recollections, i.e. the good old days?
Oh, yeah. That's interesting, Carol. So, you know, most of us, when we pine for times gone by or the good old days or something like that, we're definitely engaging in those confirmation biases where we're ignoring the things that were not so good, right? We're just focusing on those pleasant memories or positive things that we experienced and ignoring those other things, which lead to kind of an overly rosy perception of the past for a lot of people. Yeah.
Well, I've heard in places, and you can have if you want to, that we tend to remember the good or the pleasurable and forget the bad part. Like, you know, the classic analogy I was, why would women want to go through childbirth again for that pain? But they're so excited, they're so happy that they have a baby.
Yeah, and then they, you know, realize, you know, oh, there's all these positive things about it that I really love. Yeah, perhaps so. Or men having, you know, impregnating women because they, you know, forget all the staying up late and changing diapers and stuff. So,
yeah. So Bruce Johnson said, great presentation skills, really hits home to him concerning our current political mess and conversations he's had with his old friends that he totally disagrees with. Sherry had another question for you. Do you think there is an intellectual genetic basis for why some questions, facts, and others are led more blindly? To some extent, there are social educational influences as well. And she trusts a psychologist who likes Batman. And I've noticed your encased comics. Are those collector items, or you just trying to keep them safe from the big?
So so those three there are actually ones that I've collected. They're in foreign languages. So when I travel abroad, I always try and pick up some comics. So the Batman one is actually in Dutch. So I picked it up in Amsterdam when I went there. Mm-hmm. So in terms of the kind of the basis for why some people maybe are more skeptical, I think like most other, you know, psychology, there is this mix of nature and nurture involved. So we know for sure that, you know, a big part of it is growing up in an atmosphere that supports and is okay with questions and questioning and you know, not hyper authoritarian and things like that. There's also some personality factors in play. So some of our research, for example, has actually looked at different kinds of what we call big five factors of personality, which are openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And those are very well established at this point as being kind of general personality factors for humans. And we've definitely found that paranormal believers versus skeptics have different personality patterns. So there's, for sure some of those aspects involved and in play. But I think a bigger, more important part than kind of any sort of natural biological tendencies is that environment, whether that's your social environment of family and community or your educational environment. None of us are naturally great critical thinkers, but all of us can be taught to be much better critical thinkers. And I think a good analogy is my mother is an artist and an art teacher. And, she would have people come into her art classroom that just had to take the class and thought that, I'm not an artist, I have no natural talent, I'll never get better. And she would help them, teach them, show them how you can get better at doing anything, even if you're not naturally, that great at it. I think critical thinking and, being a good skeptic, as it were, is really one of those things. Some of us are naturally a little better at it than others, but everybody can be taught to be better critical thinkers.
Okay. Olga Porterfield had a question. Isn't belief in supernatural somehow genetically based? She's always amazed at people who are able to break out from their cultural indoctrinations, like leaving religion.
Yeah, and it's tough to do that. And again, like I had answered Sherry's question, I think again there's a mix of biology and environment there at play, and it's tough to break out of those belief systems once they are believed, even if they're very damaging to you. And, a lot of kind of cultish religious practices are for sure good examples of that, which we see a lot in our recovering from religion work.
Barbara had a comment here just to share that she uses a website called allsides.com for balance to get balanced news. Yeah,
it's a great site where it just kind of shows you where the different kinds of biases versus factual reporting comes and lets you, choose things from the kind of the top middle, if I recall the graphic correctly, to get more balanced news.
Hey, Brian Anderson had a comment, a question. Given the fact that the world is filled with stimuluses, and should we use tools of priming and bias to enhance our subjective experience of the world? Such as, example, practice gratitude.
Yeah, so I think that's a really great question, Brian. And a lot of our interventions for different kinds of mental health problems, depression, anxiety, et cetera, really, when we break them down, are teaching people from a cognitive behavioral therapy standpoint, teaching people how to look at their world in a less maladaptively biased way. So not just paying attention to those stimuli that are going to confirm their anxiety or their fear, but helping them test those out and disconfirm them. And I think the practicing gratitude and things like that are other good examples of that, where I purposefully focus on something that is going to enhance my well-being, as opposed to those things that are not going to enhance it.
Okay. Pamela had a question about her own confirmational bias, or suggestion about her own confirmational biases, about how you can be so sure that the COVID vaccine works when there has been very few people tested and we don't know if people were actually exposed to the disease. And they've been trying to find a coronavirus for 40 years.
Yeah, so I'm not a virologist by any means, or an epidemiologist, but I have lots of friends who are. And so, I think that what I have to do in those cases is I have to trust the people who know much more about that than I do. So I have to trust the healthcare professionals who have made this their life's work to figure these things out. Just like I would hope that they would trust me about what kind of therapy is or is not most effective for a particular mental health problem. So in brief, I would say we've got, about 100,000 people involved in the 2 trials of the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccines, which are enormous amounts of people. So they're very highly statistically powered, in other words, to be able to find an effect. And we've been working on, you're right, trying to create different kinds of vaccines for various coronaviruses, specifically over the last 15 years for things like SARS and MERS. And that's actually why we were able to develop it so effectively, is because we've been trying to find that. And then we threw billions of dollars at it. And it turns out when you throw lots of money at scientists, we tend to get shit done.
It's amazing what money does, isn't it?
It's pretty crazy, right? We tend to be able to have the resources to do it. So I would say initial, I think, doubt is good, but then you have to go to those sources that know more about it than, for example, I do.
Okay, Robert Bosca suggested another source for checking. He suggests using mediabiasfactcheck.com to evaluate sources. Sherry responded to my comment about childbirth, that hormones help you forget the trade-off of childbirth for carrying the species. Also, there are hormones responsible for making you bond and simply love your offspring. I think it's biologically sound that what creates pregnancy is often thought to be pleasurable, as is eating, so we will survive as individuals and a species.
Yeah, definitely lots of biological reasons there, I think, to help us maintain our species. So.
Okay, I have several comments here from Deb, Donna, and Carol that all say excellent lecture. Thank you very much. Donna had a comment about gratitude practice helps the brain to scan for positive. It changes the structure and function of the brain. This helps balance the hardwired negativity bias.
Yeah, which is very true. So, we've got some really great studies showing that, for example, effective cognitive behavioral therapy, which often employs the same sort of practice that, gratitude practice has, does have direct measurable changes on the brain. So we can see that, in brain functioning, where that directly changes, which is really cool.
Al Canistraro, and I hope I got your name right. Do you think there are some traditional religious believers who are not maladaptive? In other words, who have sufficient reasons to hold their beliefs as being at least plausible? Can they be intellectually honest in choosing to hold their beliefs, or are all religious believers deluding themselves? It's just like, let's just pile on here with the question.
Sure. So I think it's a very interesting question about the maladaptive nature. So for the vast majority of folks out there who are religious, I would say that their beliefs are, for them, for the most part, adaptive, because they help provide things like community. They help provide ideas about predictability in the world and how the world works. So for the most part, those things are actually very adaptive. They become maladaptive when they start interfering with one's ability to, kind of navigate the real world, or be effective at living with other groups of people who maybe don't share their same beliefs. So while there are, obviously, and we can talk about those for, days, maladaptive aspects to religion, that doesn't mean that there aren't adaptive aspects for a lot of folks.
Kevin and Rachel said, thank you for a very interesting presentation. Rachel was a psych major in college, so she's always a big fan of psychology. I don't have any other comments in the chat. Sue, I see you raising your hand to speak virtually, so you're the only one I can see that's doing that. So unmute yourself, and if you want to say something. Sue's having trouble unmuting herself.
I'm sorry, Sue.
Am I unmuted?
Yes, you are.
Okay, I was having trouble getting the chat thing to work. I just want to put a plug in for another resource. I get an email pretty much every day. It's called The Flip Side. And it's here's something that's going on, and then here are from major media, mostly right-wing opinions on it, left-wing opinions on it, mostly fairly thoughtful, sometimes agreeing, sometimes not agreeing, but and not wild-eyed radical ideas. They're, you know, I find that a good corrective to just hearing one side of things.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
I hadn't heard of that before, but yeah, thanks. I'll check into that.
I saw Robert Bosco raising his hand in a window, and I can only see a few windows. So if you need to, if anybody else has questions, either raise your virtual hand or when there's a break, speak up, please.
Yeah, the site that I mentioned, mediabiasfactcheck.com, I think the part of it that I think is important is that they also evaluate factfulness or accuracy as a separate entity. That is, how many times have they had stories that were found to be completely false? Because I think it's a waste of time to go to sites that are putting up things that are false. And, you know, it shows that their modus operandi is, you know, they don't care about what the truth is. They're just putting it up. They're not following journalistic principles, whereas other organizations at least tend to follow them much more. And so having an assessment of not only bias, but accuracy is real important. And I wonder what our speakers, Caleb, what your thoughts are about that.
Yeah, so I think that's very, very similar to when we talk about, for example, psychological testing, which is that we need things to be both valid and reliable, right? So reliability meaning, you know, it's the same every time, and validity meaning it actually does measure what we think it measures. And the same thing is what you're talking about, right? So, you know, there's that old saying, even a stopped clock is right twice a day. Like, sure, there may be something on this site every once in a while that's accurate, but if 99% of it is not, I can probably find better places to get that information.
Yeah.
Okay. Great point. Thanks, Robert.
Donna had suggested another site for goodnewsnetwork.org. Does anybody else have any other questions for Caleb? If not, Caleb, I want to thank you very much. A very interesting presentation. Certainly engendered a lot of good discussion. Again, appreciate everything you've done. I hope your pigs stop fighting.
They probably won't, but you know, we can always hope. So
just feed them.
Yeah. Thank you all for having me. I really appreciate it. Really enjoyed talking with you all today.
Great.